Andrew Johnson was the 17th President of the United States. 6 weeks after he became Vice President under Abraham Lincoln and 6 days following the effective end of the Civil War, Johnson assumed the presidency upon Lincoln's assassination in April 1865 and served until 1869. Johnson was a member of the Democratic Party. He did not have a vice president. At the time, there was no constitutional provision addressing who would fill the office in the event that it was vacated, as it was by Johnson himself. Johnson played a key role in the first years of Reconstruction, the post-war period during which new policies were established in formerly seceded Southern states. He was also the first American president to undergo impeachment. His impeachment began in February 1868 following Johnson's removal of Lincoln-era Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton from office in defiance of the Tenure of Office Act, which was passed by Congress the year prior and required the president to get Senate approval before removing certain officials. The impeachment effort failed by 1 vote. Prior to serving as president and as Lincoln's vice president, Johnson owned a tailoring business and served as mayor of Greeneville, Tennessee, U.S. Representative, Governor of Tennessee, and U.S. Senator. Johnson returned to the Senate in 1875 and died later that year. Andrew Johnson, December 29, 1808 to July 31, 1875, was an American politician who served as the 17th President of the United States from 1865 to 1869. He assumed the presidency following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, as he was vice president at that time. Johnson was a Democrat who ran with Abraham Lincoln on the National Union Party ticket, coming to office as the Civil War concluded. He favored quick restoration of the seceded states to the Union without protection for the newly freed people who were formerly enslaved. This led to conflict with the Republican-dominated Congress, culminating in his impeachment by the House of Representatives in 1868. He was acquitted in the Senate by 1 vote. Johnson was born into poverty and never attended school. He was apprenticed as a tailor and worked in several frontier towns before settling in Greeneville, Tennessee, serving as an alderman and mayor before being elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives in 1835. After briefly serving in the Tennessee Senate, Johnson was elected to the House of Representatives in 1843, where he served 5 two-year terms. He became governor of Tennessee for 4 years, and was elected by the legislature to the Senate in 1857. During his congressional service, he sought passage of the Homestead Bill, which was enacted soon after he left his Senate seat in 1862. Southern slave states seceded to form the Confederate States of America, including Tennessee, but Johnson remained firmly with the Union. He was the only sitting senator from a Confederate state who did not resign his seat upon learning of his state's secession. In 1862, Lincoln appointed him as military governor of Tennessee after most of it had been retaken. In 1864, Johnson was a logical choice as running mate for Lincoln, who wished to send a message of national unity in his re-election campaign, and became vice president after a victorious election in 1864. Johnson implemented his own form of presidential reconstruction, a series of proclamations directing the seceded states to hold conventions and elections to reform their civil governments. Southern states returned many of their old leaders and passed black codes to deprive the freedmen of many civil liberties, but congressional Republicans refused to seat legislators from those states and advanced legislation to overrule the Southern actions. Johnson vetoed their bills, and congressional Republicans overrode him, setting a pattern for the remainder of his presidency. B. Johnson opposed the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to former slaves. In 1866, he went on an unprecedented national tour promoting his executive policies, seeking to break Republican opposition. 5. As the conflict grew between the branches of government, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act restricting Johnson's ability to fire cabinet officials. He persisted in trying to dismiss Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, but ended up being impeached by the House of Representatives and narrowly avoided conviction in the Senate. He did not win the 1,868 Democratic presidential nomination and left office the following year. Johnson returned to Tennessee after his presidency and gained some vindication when he was elected to the Senate in 1875, making him the only president to afterwards serve in the Senate. He died 5 months into his term. Johnson's strong opposition to federally guaranteed rights for Black Americans is widely criticized. Historians have consistently ranked him one of the worst presidents in American history. With the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson became the 17th President of the United States, 1865 to 1869, an old-fashioned Southern Jacksonian Democrat of pronounced states' rights views. With the assassination of Lincoln, the presidency fell upon an old-fashioned Southern Jacksonian Democrat of pronounced states' rights views. Although an honest and honorable man, Andrew Johnson was one of the most unfortunate of presidents. Arrayed against him were the radical Republicans in Congress, brilliantly led and ruthless in their tactics. Johnson was no match for them. Born in Raleigh, North Carolina, in 1808, Johnson grew up in poverty. He was apprenticed to a tailor as a boy, but ran away. He opened a tailor shop in Greeneville, Tennessee, married Eliza McCardle, and participated in debates at the local academy. Entering politics, he became an adept stump speaker, championing the common man and vilifying the plantation aristocracy. As a member of the House of Representatives and the Senate in the 1840s and 50s, he advocated a homestead bill to provide a free farm for the poor man. During the secession crisis, Johnson remained in the Senate even when Tennessee seceded, which made him a hero in the North and a traitor in the eyes of most Southerners. In 1862 President Lincoln appointed him military governor of Tennessee, and Johnson used the state as a laboratory for Reconstruction. In 1864 the Republicans, contending that their National Union Party was for all loyal men, nominated Johnson, a Southerner and a Democrat, for vice president. After Lincoln's death, President Johnson proceeded to reconstruct the former Confederate states while Congress was not in session in 1865. He pardoned all who would take an oath of allegiance, but required leaders and men of wealth to obtain special presidential pardons. By the time Congress met in December 1865, most Southern states were reconstructed, slavery was being abolished, but black codes to regulate the freedmen were beginning to appear. Radical Republicans in Congress moved vigorously to change Johnson's program. They gained the support of Northerners who were dismayed to see Southerners keeping many pre-war leaders and imposing many pre-war restrictions upon Negroes. The Radicals' first step was to refuse to seat any senator or representative from the old Confederacy. Next they passed measures dealing with the former slaves. Johnson vetoed the legislation. The Radicals mustered enough votes in Congress to pass legislation over his veto, the first time that Congress had overridden a president on an important bill. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which established Negroes as American citizens and forbade discrimination against them. A few months later Congress submitted to the states the 14th Amendment, which specified that no state should deprive any person of life, liberty, or property, without due process of law. All the former Confederate states except Tennessee refused to ratify the amendment. Further, there were 2 bloody race riots in the South. Speaking in the Middle West, Johnson faced hostile audiences. The Radical Republicans won an overwhelming victory in congressional elections that fall. In March 1867, the Radicals effected their own plan of Reconstruction, again placing Southern states under military rule. They passed laws placing restrictions upon the president. When Johnson allegedly violated one of these, the Tenure of Office Act, by dismissing Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, the House voted 11 articles of impeachment against him. He was tried by the Senate in the spring of 1868 and acquitted by 1 vote. In 1875, Tennessee returned Johnson to the Senate. He died a few months later. After the election of Republican Party candidate Abraham Lincoln, Southern states began seceding from the Union. By the time Lincoln took the oath of office, 7 states had already left the Union, with 4 more to follow including Johnson's home state of Tennessee. During the crisis, Johnson remained in the United States Senate after his state seceded, the only Southern senator to do so. In recognition of his commitment to the Union, President Lincoln appointed him military governor of Tennessee in 1862. In this position, Johnson began to support emancipation not because he supported racial equality, but for military expediency. His primary concerns were ending the war quickly and crippling the Confederacy. To prove his new stance, and loyalty to President Lincoln, Johnson freed the enslaved individuals he owned in 1863 and ordered total emancipation in Tennessee the following year. His actions appealed to the different factions and leaders within the Republican Party, including President Lincoln, who desired a political ticket that represented unity and a commitment to preserve the Union. As a result, the party nominated Johnson, a Southerner and a Democrat, for vice president. President Lincoln's tragic and unexpected assassination thrust Andrew Johnson into the presidency. He moved into the White House with his family and brought Florence and William as paid workers. But President Johnson's racial prejudices and inability to heal a broken nation quickly became a larger problem. Johnson pardoned all who would take an oath of allegiance to the Constitution of the United States, but required Confederate leaders and men of wealth to obtain special presidential pardons. While he pursued reconciliation with Southern white citizens, he generally ignored the implementation of black codes and other racist policies by state legislatures that infringed upon the rights of newly freed African Americans. Radical Republicans in Congress lambasted Johnson's approach to Reconstruction. They gained the political support of Northerners who were dismayed to see Southerners voting many pre-war leaders back into office. The Radicals refused to seat any senator or representative from the Confederacy. They also passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to protect the rights of formerly enslaved individuals, which Johnson subsequently vetoed. The Radicals mustered enough votes to pass the legislation over his veto, one of 15 times that Congress voted to override President Johnson. A few months later, Congress submitted the 14th Amendment to the states, which specified all persons born or naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property, without due process of law. President Johnson publicly expressed his disapproval of the amendment and encouraged state legislatures to reject it. All former Confederate states, except Tennessee, refused to ratify the amendment. Two violent race riots broke out in Memphis and New Orleans in 1866. Dozens of African Americans were beaten and killed, furthering the argument that the federal government needed to do more to protect African American citizens. After the Radical Republicans won an overwhelming victory in congressional elections that fall, they crafted their own Reconstruction plan, placing Southern states under martial law and passing other laws to restrict the powers of the president. In February 1868, Johnson moved to dismiss Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton without Senate approval during full session, which violated the Tenure of Office Act. This law had been passed by Radical Republicans a year earlier, vetoed by Johnson, and then overridden by Congress. Stanton's dismissal triggered impeachment proceedings, and the House voted to charge Johnson on 11 articles of impeachment. The Senate tried Johnson in the spring of 1868 and voted on 3 of the articles, acquitting him by a single vote each time. In 1875, Johnson felt vindicated when the citizens of Tennessee elected him to the Senate that had nearly thrown him out of the presidency, but he died a few months later on July 31, 1875 after suffering a stroke. Outline of Johnson's professional and political career. 1808, born in Raleigh, North Carolina. 1826, opened a tailor shop in Greeneville, Tennessee. 1829, elected alderman of Greeneville. 1834, elected mayor of Greeneville. 1835, elected to Tennessee State Legislature. 1843, elected to U.S. House of Representatives. 1853, elected Governor of Tennessee. 1856, elected to U.S. Senate. 1862, appointed as Tennessee's military governor by Pres. Abraham Lincoln. 1864, selected as vice presidential running mate by Lincoln. March 4, 1865, sworn in as vice president. April 9, 1865, American Civil War effectively ended with the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. April 15, 1865, sworn in as president upon Lincoln's death. March 1869, left White House. 1875, served in the U.S. Senate again. July 31, 1875, died of stroke at age 66. Before the presidency. Andrew Johnson was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, on December 29, 1808 to importer Jacob Johnson, who died when Andrew was 3, and Mary Polly McDonough Johnson, a seamstress. Johnson grew up in poverty and received no formal education. As a teenager, he apprenticed for a local tailor. He started his own tailor shop in Greeneville, Tennessee, in 1826. Johnson's political career began with local office. He was elected alderman of Greeneville in 1829, then mayor of the city in 1834. He served in the Tennessee state legislature before a long stint in the U.S. House of Representatives. Johnson was elected as Tennessee's governor in 1853 and served 2 terms before returning to Congress, this time, to the Senate. He was against the secession of Southern states, like his own, from the Union. Tennessee seceded from the Union in 1860 following Abraham Lincoln's election as president, and Johnson was the sole Southern senator to remain in the chamber. Lincoln appointed Johnson as military governor of Tennessee in 1862, tasking him with re-establishing federal authority in the seceded state. The president signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared some Southern slaves free, in 1863. Though Johnson initially opposed the abolition of slavery, he became supportive of the proclamation as a way to end the Civil War and after securing an exemption from its provisions for Tennessee. In his 1864 re-election bid, Lincoln, the Northern Republican, chose Johnson, the Southern Democrat, as his vice presidential running mate. Lincoln defeated Democratic nominee George B. McClellan with 55% of the popular vote and 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21. Lincoln and Johnson were sworn in on March 4, 1865. Johnson assumed the presidency on April 15, 1865, the day Lincoln died from a gunshot wound incurred at Ford's Theater the night before. 6 days earlier, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant in Virginia, marking the effective end of the Civil War. With the presidency, Johnson inherited the responsibility to guide the rebuilding of the South during the post-war period known as Reconstruction. Johnson believed that states should have primary control over their rebuilding. This clashed with the Republican-dominated Congress's efforts to exert more influence over post-war policies in the South. Johnson pardoned many ex-Confederates and allowed them to reclaim confiscated land that was set to be resettled by freed slaves as part of the Freedmen's Bureau Act passed by Congress in 1865. Many Southern states enacted laws that placed restrictions on black people's activities, including taxes imposed for performing work besides farm or servant labor and limitations on types of property that black people could own. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which declared all people born in the U.S. to be citizens equal before the law. Johnson vetoed the act, but Congress overrode the veto, making it the first major piece of legislation to be passed despite a presidential veto. After the 1866 midterm elections, the Republican-dominated Congress largely took control of Reconstruction policies. In 1867, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act in an effort to prevent Johnson from using his presidential powers to remove Lincoln-era appointed officials from office by requiring the president to obtain Senate approval before removing any official who had been confirmed by the Senate. Johnson challenged the new law by replacing Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton without Senate input on February 21, 1868. 3 days later, the House voted to impeach Johnson, beginning a process that ended on May 26, one vote short of removing him from office. In 1868, Democrats chose former New York Governor Horatio Seymour as their nominee for the presidential election, making Johnson a one-term president who never ran in an election for the office. Ulysses S. Grant, R., won the election and succeeded Johnson as the 18th President of the United States. After leaving the White House, Johnson ran unsuccessfully for U.S. Senate in 1869 and U.S. House in 1872. He won one more election in his lifetime, returning to the Senate in 1875 months before he died of a stroke on July 31. In 1827, Johnson married Eliza McCardle, who tutored her husband in reading, writing, and math. The couple had 5 children together. Thank you for watching this video.